Good afternoon and welcome. I know that some of you are still waiting for your food in line, and I want you to remain, but I will ask for your attention for a few minutes as I convene us and get us started. I want to welcome you to the 2025 Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative's Civic Educator Conference. Our theme this year, as you all know, is American Inheritance, claiming the Declaration's promise. I'm Matthew Brogdon. I'm the Senior Director in the Center for Constitutional Studies and have the privilege of working with the wonderful team that has been putting this conference together and convening you throughout the day and giving us all this opportunity to consider our inheritance as Americans and the tradition that we have benefited from and continue to attempt to improve. I always like to say inheritances are things that of course we want to preserve, but we also have to seek to improve. And so I think the notion of inheritance, which is something we have focused on as we approach the 250th anniversary of America's Declaration of Independence, inheritance captures this dual element of being a self-governing people, gratitude for what we have inherited, an effort to preserve it for future generations, and the moral imperative to improve it in needed ways so that we hand it over to our children, our grandchildren, for not just our children and grandchildren, but those who will come to this country seeking to make this inheritance their own. The story of America is in part one of people who begin their lives outside of America's inheritance and find in the course of their life at some point that they have come to be a part of the American inheritance. They have become beneficiaries of that promissory note, as Martin Luther King put it. So I want to acknowledge some folks who are responsible for making this happen. First and foremost, the Civic Thought and Leadership team, our director of that initiative, Robert Burton, and many of the staff that work with him, civic education staff, most especially our event staff, Michelle, who is busy there. We are very grateful, Michelle, and we're grateful to the rest of the CCS staff who has been instrumental in putting this together. If you could all please join me in giving them a round of applause. We have this year two crucial sponsors who represent not just a partnership for the Center for Constitutional Studies, but in many ways an aspiration, people who have blazed a path in civic education in this country and in preserving and improving our constitutional inheritance. And they are both Franklin Penn sponsors for this event. That is the Bill of Rights Institute, which has been at this work for almost 3 decades now, I think. I remember using Bill of Rights Institute materials when I was an undergraduate and graduate student, actually. And we are grateful to be able to partner with them and that they have the confidence to come and lend their expertise and great experience to the effort that we're making here. So our gratitude to BRI, as we affectionately refer to them. Secondly, the National Constitution Center has joined us as a Franklin Penn sponsor. The National Constitution Center has been at the work they're doing with a magnificent Independence I guess it would be the Independence Mall, right? It's the mall across from Independence Hall. Who's visited National Constitution Center? A lot of you have been there, so this is a spectacular thing. And of course, the first thing anybody should do if they go visit the National Constitution Center is go into the Hall of Founders and figure out which founder you look best in a selfie with. My daughter was delighted to discover she's the same height as James Madison. And I'm buddies with Gouverneur Morris, so that's how we, yeah, that's right. So thank you to both the National Constitution Center and the Bill of Rights Institute for joining us in this work. I also want to extend our thanks to I would say long-standing sponsor. It feels like we've been partnering with them for a long time, even though it's just been a couple of years now. The Utah America 250 Commission, and I don't see any of our commission members in the room, but our Utah American 250 Commission has undertaken the task of helping our state lead our state and convene organizations like ours to celebrate this 250th anniversary of American independence. And we are grateful to them for their co-sponsorship of our many events. I want to, before I introduce our guest speaker, our keynote for lunch, mention a few exciting pieces of news that the Center for Constitutional Studies here at Utah Valley University is deeply proud of. One is this gathering itself. This is our largest civic educator conference to date. We have over 150 educator attendees, and I just finished one of these primary source seminars, and it has improved my day tremendously. And I am deeply encouraged by the representative set of educators around that table joining me in conversation for those things. So this is an exciting convening, and we are looking forward to the future years that we enjoy under this initiative. Also wanted to mention the Center for Constitutional Studies this last year completed the work of its first cohort in our Master of Arts in Constitutional Government, Civics, and Law. This is a master's program that can be completed in 14 months between June of one year and August of the next, principally with work in the summers. And this is a program that we just got off the ground year before last. We graduated our first cohort just this August, which was exciting for us to see that vision come to fruition. This is a program that is focused on the substance of American founding principles, ideas, constitutional law, and governing institutions to give teachers who go into the classroom greater confidence and expertise as they tackle these things with their students. That program will see a significant expansion this year because our friends at the Jack Miller Center partnered with us to obtain funding from the John Templeton Foundation, which will allow us to add a second cohort of 25 students drawn from around the country and help to reduce the cost for those teachers. So this will allow teachers from outside of Utah to complete this program at effectively in-state rates. And that is a significant expansion of this program, which we foresee growing tremendously in the coming years. And also, we got news this last week. The Center for Constitutional Studies is the recipient of a major new Department of Education grant to bring primary source seminars to teachers not just in Utah, but in our neighboring states as well. So that the Center for Constitutional Studies is taking a role of regional leadership in bringing this kind of equipping to our educators. So exciting things going on. I am especially gratified to be introducing our keynote speaker today. I met David Bobb when I was a graduate student still, actually, and he was a faculty member at Hillsdale College and running their Kirby Center for the study of, for constitutional studies and citizenship, I think, in Washington, D.C. And I remember when he moved into the role of running the Bill of Rights Institute as its new president, as a young scholar. David still looks like a young scholar. As a young scholar, and took the reins of that organization. And under his leadership for the last 25 years, the Bill of Rights Institute has become, without doubt, a model for the way that we can in a nonpartisan manner, convey our constitutional and political tradition to future generations. And most admirably, they have put in the hours and time through the generosity of those that have supported them to make the resources they create freely available. And it is a tremendous thing to have access to resources that you can put in front of educators as an organization like the Center for Constitutional Studies, trustworthy resources you can point people to and can be implemented without cost in their classrooms and carry those into all sorts of spaces. And so we are delighted to be able to welcome David Bobb, the president of the Bill of Rights Institute, and a great friend to the Center for Constitutional Studies, to speak to you today. David?
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you to Robert Burton, to Scott Paul, everybody at the Center for Constitutional Studies. It's such a pleasure to be with you. It's really an honor to be with all of you teachers today. I hope that you know that in your participation in these programs here at Utah Valley University and the Center, that you have the opportunity to be affiliated with the finest university-based civics center in the nation. The center's clarity of purpose, cogency of argument, and service to this state and community is really unique. It's outstanding. I'm honored to be your guest today. I'm pleased to be joined by two of my colleagues. Stan Swim, the Chief Program Officer for the Bill of Rights Institute, is also an alumnus of this institution, having majored in computer science, and now he leads our programs. Rachel Davison-Humphreys in the back will be leading some sessions this afternoon about primary source documents. I also want to thank you who every day make teaching your calling. Your dedication inspires us at the Bill of Rights Institute. Thanks for the daily work that you give, the light of reason and the love of liberty. For those of you who did the readings, that's from Lincoln. There won't be a quiz now or at the end of my talk, but I think you really embody those two things when you bring that to your students, a task that we know is not easy. You know, the horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk reminds us of the preciousness of life, light, and liberty. My hope and prayer for this campus is that I think there's maybe some undergraduate or graduate students here that you will experience that light undimmed by the tragedy that happened here. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Frederick Douglass. We're going to talk about the inheritance. We're going to talk about how the cornerstone to our American regime, the Declaration of Independence, has helped drive forces for change, abolition, women's suffrage, and the civil rights movement. We're going to leave lots of time for questions, and I hope that it can build on the morning sessions, one of which I participated in and found to be really stimulating. We want to make this substantive, but also helpful, that you can come away better appreciating these ideas and how they can be conveyed to the students who are in your classrooms. Frederick Douglass gave his most famous speech on July 5th, not the 4th. Rochester's Corinthian Hall, with its 4 huge columns, was packed with some 600 people. The most photographed American of the 19th century, Douglass, in 1852, the date of this speech, was well known in New York and around the country as one of the nation's leading abolitionists. Douglass's topic that day was the Declaration of Independence and its promise. It was about promises broken as much as promises kept. For Douglass, the topic was, quote, your national independence, your political freedom, and your national life. Those are all quotations from Douglass's speech, July 5th, not the 4th. Reminding his audience that in 1852, the United States of America was a mere 76 years old, Douglass told his fellow citizens that America was, quote, only in the beginning of your national career. How many of you have read this speech? Okay, keep your hand up if you've read it with high school or middle school students. Okay, I'll make here the plea that you should try it. It is remarkably fresh. Douglass writes with a vibrancy and a poignancy. There are a lot of people today that we might say are July 5th, not 4th Americans. And I'm going to say more about what I mean by that. Douglass gave it on the 5th intentionally, because on the 4th, in America, a lot of times there were slave auctions held. And he wanted to say, you and yours, not our and ours, for a particular point. He was saying that the promise that was there in the Declaration was yet to be fulfilled. It's a complicated speech. I won't go into all parts of it, but it begins on this note of both admiration and alienation. It combines those two powerful emotions. Douglass felt alienated from the celebration that had happened on the 4th, but admiration for what prompted it. The Declaration of Independence was the cause of the celebration. Its principles, and here again I'm quoting from Douglass, were final, immortal, life-giving. The men who made it were wise and worthy of praise. The Declaration, Douglass said, is, quote, the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. I didn't bring a ring bolt. They don't have to be very big, but if you look it up, you'll see a thing that's used to anchor a ship. It also was used, and Douglass was using this image of a ring bolt intentionally, of course, to shackle an enslaved person. So think of it. He's here July 5th, Rochester, New York, packed hall, and he's saying, there's a thing that we can all look to. It's the Declaration. It's so important that it can be our anchor. A ring bolt ensures that the ship is actually anchored. For Douglass, the Declaration was the past, present, and future of freedom and equality for all. Its promise was everything for America. Here's words that I'll repeat twice, just because they're so evocative. Here again, I'm quoting from Frederick Douglass. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost. Let me read that again. All right, so he's opened in this speech by saying, this celebration is you and yours. But he's saying these principles have the power to rescue us. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost. Here comes the hard part. Douglass then goes on to warn his audience and his fellow Americans that instead of availing themselves of the saving principles, Douglass's contemporaries were missing their opportunity. Quote, the sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. End quote. As Douglas saw it, unless his contemporaries got right with the Declaration, they would continue in their arrogance, making what should be a day for celebration a day of shame. Here I quote again from Douglas. "America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future." We're going to come back to Douglas at the end, but think of that moment. How would you have responded? You're a contemporary. You're not enslaved. Before there were fireworks or 4th of July parades, great commemorative speeches like Douglas's, or humble recitation by children of the Declaration's words, Laura Ingalls Wilder claims that the townsfolk in her community were able to recite the whole of the Declaration. That's pretty impressive. I don't know if that was a humble brag, but it was true that in many communities they read the Declaration aloud. Before there were any of those things, though, there was a document that was read aloud for Americans to hear. And it was done for the first time. Historians still dispute exactly how that went on. The Declaration of Independence has been in the ears of Americans, we think, since the first informal reading in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. But this one was attended, it was noted, by, quote, very few respectable citizens. So it was kind of a drive-by. This was followed, though, by a formal public reading on July 8th, at which Colonel John Nixon, a Philadelphia officer and financier, read the document to a large and distinguished gathering. Ever since we Americans heard the Declaration, we have been arguing over its meaning. It divides and unites us still today. Let's pause just for 3 quick reflections on the Declaration. I know we've been digging in this morning about its meaning. Here are 3 things that I've been struck by. When the 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson sat down to draft the document, we know he wrote under duress of time, maybe a little procrastination, right? He didn't have much time. But there was a point at which, when he's writing with a quill pen, he scratched a word out. And he did so, we have discovered, only in 2010, to obscure a word. The word he wrote, finally, having scratched out a word, was citizens. Does anybody know the word that he had written originally and scratched out? Subjects. Think of what that one scratch of the pen meant. We were citizens, not subjects. Think of that shift. It's a monumental shift. By the way, we found that out, what word was underneath it, because of a technological innovation done at the Library of Congress, where they were able to scrape back the layers of ink on the parchment and reveal that word. You can look up the story. It was a remarkable kind of thing. Subjects to citizens, that's the first thing. The second is, if you haven't read them, and if you haven't read them with your students, read the grievances. They're really interesting. Doesn't take too long. And one exercise that I've found to be fruitful with young people is to say, how do the grievances pertain to what we now know as the 3 branches of government? Because the argument of the Declaration, beyond its preamble and the words that we mainly anchor on, is really quite simple. It's saying that we had a prince who became a tyrant. And he became a tyrant because he arrogated unto himself the powers that could only be divided. And so he would do things to make the legislative effort impossible. And he would do things to stymie even the executives in the colonies. And he would do things like changing up the dates or places of gathering for judges. All of those things are power grabs, unbefitting a good ruler. But we're not subjects, we're citizens. So I mentioned that Jefferson drafted this, but he didn't get the final word. His editorial team, by Jefferson's lights, utterly ruined his perfect draft. Jefferson had an ego. And one of the things that they did was add 2 more references to God. But I think in toto, they tell a really interesting story. So you have the laws of nature and of nature's God, and you have the reference to the Creator. In the last final paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, you also have supreme judge of the world, and then a reference to divine providence. So Jefferson had 2, and his committee added 2. But I think they kind of tell an interesting story. And it's like the grievance story. No human being can take on the legislative, executive, and judicial functions. No committee can. No one power, mortal, human, can do it. Perhaps only a divine power could actually exercise that amount of power. I think that's part of the argument that's at work there. That's the Declaration. We can come back to it in the Q&A. But what it does is a remarkable thing. In its simplicity, in its grandeur, it provides a self-correcting principle. I don't think there's any other regime in the history of humankind that built at its cornerstone a self-correcting mechanism. That's what we're here to talk about today. How is it that you're able to start something as monumental as a new regime, a new order for the ages, the founders said, and say that you're building in a principle that condemns even some of your own actions, right? Because Jefferson himself held hundreds of slaves. And 2/3 of the original signers of that document, 2/3 of them held slaves. And yet the Declaration, became the force, the reason, the word for why slavery ultimately was able to be put, as Lincoln said, in course of ultimate extinction. Why women were able to gain agency in the eyes of the law and gain the right to vote, among other rights that they had been denied. And ultimately, that Americans of African descent were able to secure the rights that were incipient in that promise. When Abraham Lincoln in 1863 began his address at Gettysburg Battlefield with the phrase, 77 years ago, he reminded his fellow citizens that their cause in the Civil War was also the cause of 1776. In the year of America's birth, Lincoln stated, here I'm quoting from the Gettysburg Address, "Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." By recalling the year 1776, Lincoln reminds us that the Constitution of 1789 stands upon the principles of the Declaration of Independence. We kind of take that for granted today, right? You gotta take them together. They go together. When I was at Hillsdale College, Matthew mentioned that I spent 12 years there. I had the pleasure of serving as a teaching assistant to the historian David McCullough. McCullough taught a course to undergraduates. It was terrifying for them because he was prone to call on them. But what McCullough said that will always stick with me is he said about the founders, it's not like they sat around saying, "Isn't it great being the founders?" Right? We're talking about all this stuff that happened, right? An inheritance. As if it was inevitable. None of it was inevitable. The Constitution flowing from the principles of the Declaration was not inevitable. July 6th was not inevitable. And so when we think of our topic for today, try to put yourself back in the uncertainty, the contingency of those men and women who fought and crafted the Declaration. The saving principles, to use that phrase from Frederick Douglass, if you think of kind of simply what does that mean, I think it means liberty and equality for all. The American understanding of this relationship was revolutionary. It is revolutionary. The American Revolution was one of ideas. That thing, moving from subject to citizen, did not have precedent. The Declaration affirms the revolutionary idea that all human beings are created equal in their possession of certain unalienable rights. I know in our small group this morning we broke down, well, what does it actually mean? What does that phrase mean? It's kind of an odd word, right? These rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know that as a kind of totemic triad, right? It's all so familiar. These rights are given to human beings by nature's God, not by government. Because the government does not give these rights to human beings, no government can take them away. These natural rights are an individual's most precious property. Government's primary purpose is to protect these fundamental rights. The Declaration is an indictment of a prince that has become a tyrant, of a government that has betrayed its purpose. Instead of protecting his subjects' rights, King George III routinely violated them. Citizenship requires self-government above all. Americans, James Madison wrote under the pen name Publius, quote, "Rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government." They saw it as an experiment. And each generation, I would suggest to you, of those men and women who fought for the extension of rights also saw it as an experiment. Today, I think we can ask ourselves, do we have another 250 years in us? Do we have another 100? 50? Dr. Burton opened our conference by saying that a very large percentage of Americans see us on the precipice of a civil war. How do we live as self-governing citizens in an experiment? A republic as framed in the American Constitution is founded on the people's consent. It requires not that the people rule directly, but rather that they are directly responsible for electing their representatives. These representatives, in turn, are responsible to the people. Asked what kind of government the secretive Constitutional Convention of 1787 had produced in its long, hot summer deliberations in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin famously replied, "A republic if you can keep it." I'm sure everybody in this room has heard this story. It's almost as familiar as to be hackneyed. Our students don't know it, though. What does it really mean? The keeping of the republic is what the abolitionists did. It was not easy or inevitable. The keeping of the republic was what the suffragists did. It was not automatic or inevitable. The keeping of the republic is what the civil rights pioneers did. You have to keep the government's duties at the central level limited to their constitutional purpose. Doesn't mean weak government. It does mean government that is able to do the things which it must do and do them very well. Ensuring that liberty would be protected required a regime in which the powers of government were separated. Any other regime or arrangement would threaten liberty. Here's a quotation from Madison. We talked earlier about tyranny. This is a really concise definition of tyranny from Madison, writing as Publius. "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." So you see there's a kind of chain of logic that flows from the Declaration. We see it now. They were feeling their way. The brightest minds and best leaders, I think, did see all the way through. Madison was one of them. But he lived the precarity. He didn't even know if George Washington was going to show up to the Constitutional Convention, right? You ever do that thing where you get the invitation and it has a little asterisk next to the like main, person or band, like invited? That's what Madison did for Washington coming to the Constitutional Convention, right? He got people to come to the thing, and then you know what? Washington showed up, of course, on time, and nobody else did. So one of my favorite moments, like where could you be if you could overhear this, is Madison, all 5 feet 3 inches of him, right? Standing, looking at the general who had just come in across the land to arrive at this meeting that looks like it might not even happen. Washington did not turn on his heel and leave in a huff. He stayed around for a couple weeks so that they could do that meeting. He's sitting there in the chair, nearly silent the entire convention. Right? So you gotta avoid tyranny. You gotta pursue liberty, and you gotta secure equality for everybody. This is, quote, a great improvement in the science of politics, right? That's what Madison, Jay, and Hamilton are writing about in the Federalist. The American framers, in other words, affirmed the ancient wisdom that for liberty to last, it had to be consistent with order. And here I'd like to just reflect for a couple of minutes on human nature. Human beings, according to the founders, are by nature enough inclined to evil that they cannot be entrusted with unlimited power. Human beings are by nature good enough, though, that they can govern themselves. Have you thought of that balance? I have 2 teenage boys now. They're 16 and 14. And sometimes I'll reflect on human nature when I'm trying to argue with them. Because you see the bad in them, right? You wonder, how could they be so irrational? How do they not see what I'm trying to tell them here in all of my wisdom as a parent, right? And here I am at an organization that's supposed to be good with teenagers, and I'm so bad at 2 of them. And then you see, in the same moment often, maybe within the same minute, maybe the next hour, that potential. You know that 86% of the words that we speak about teenagers are negative? Let's reverse that. I know you all see the negative. There's a lot of it. It's hard to teach middle school and high school students. But we also see the positive, right? We see this enormous potential. We see this opportunity. That, I think, is what the founders were getting at. Human beings are a mix of the bad and the good. But we got to build the regime with the bad in mind, but also to be able to reach for the limitless potential of human opportunity. That's hard to get right. That's what happened, I think, in the framing of the Constitution. Not that it was perfect. By the way, when we say that we're a more perfect union, and I'll be happy to be corrected by anybody here, we weren't setting ourselves up on a journey to perfection. There's often a kind of misunderstanding about that. I think what they meant was it's better than the one before, because the Articles of Confederation was such a symbolic thing, right? We can be certainly better than that. And yes, we can be better because we can amend the document. But it was not saying that we are going to be able to change the nature of human beings. We have to recognize that human beings are as they are and seek to secure the saving principles for all. Here, sir, the people govern, Hamilton stated at the Constitutional Convention. Washington said this: "The Constitution is the guide which I never will abandon." Back to Madison. "Happily for America, happily we trust for the whole human race, they pursued a new and more noble course." He was talking about those who fought at the time of the American Revolution. Here's a passage about human nature that I think captures what I'm trying to convey. And this comes again from James Madison. "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence." Republican government, small r, Republican, representative government, presupposes the existence of those high qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Isn't that interesting? So you recognize that human beings are capable of all kinds of bad, but in order to do what we're doing, citizen stuff, not subject stuff, you gotta have the high qualities. Now, we're after lunch here, let's make this interactive. You've had your dessert. If you haven't, go grab one, they're good. You won't interrupt anything here. What do you think are the most important qualities that we need to challenge ourselves in this age or in any other? Just shout out, raise your hand if you want to speak up. What are the virtues that you think? Robert mentioned a few at the top. What do we need in order to?
Civic charity.
Okay, civic charity. Another word for love, good. Wisdom, humility, okay, others? Self-discipline. Moderation, okay. Yes, sir. Honor, courage. Great. Industry, empathy. Great list. Some commercial virtue, another one, sorry. Temperance, excellent. So, some classical virtues, a few cardinal virtues in there, right? The hinges on which all others rely, courage among them. Moderation. I didn't hear any prudence. Prudence is kind of sounds wimpy, right? Sounds like humility. Moderation, another wimpy virtue. What were you all saying there? Was it a lament kind of for things that we've not done as much today? Have they ever been in huge supply? I think at every stage in our nation's maturation, the list has been probably about that. What are we going to do about it? How do we make that happen? Now, in the time that I have left, and then we'll talk about wherever Matthew and you all want to go with your questions, let's talk about abolition, suffrage, and the civil rights movement. And the reason that I wanted to ask about those virtues is I think they were on full display in the abolition struggle. Here I'll go back to Frederick Douglass. I didn't tell you, because we started kind of in the middle of things, right, with his great speech in 1852. But Douglass was born in the same year in which Illinois became a state and in which Abraham Lincoln's mother died. He never knew for sure the day of his birth or the month. For a while, he was even unsure about the year. His best guess was that he was born in February 1818. Officially, his mother named him Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He later used the surname Stanley, then Johnson, and then finally Douglas, which he chose after the lead character, plus an S, in Sir Walter Scott's poem Lady of the Lake. He didn't know the identity of his father. He met his mother on 3 or 4 occasions. She had to travel 13 miles from where she was enslaved to visit him. And one of the visits, she came upon him being denied his daily ration. She stood up for him and said, "Give my son what he should have." And Douglass said that at the age of, I think it was 8, maybe 9 years old, that was the first time that anybody had done that, stood in the gap for him. He slept on the floor for his entire childhood. He owned 1 pair of pants. And all of this added up, in his words, to an unintelligible beginning. If you have an opportunity to read that speech with your students and you find that it really sticks with them, take up one of his 3 autobiographies. They're stirring. What he did to gain freedom was remarkable. I won't go through the whole story, but the short version is first he worked on himself. He, like his mother, taught himself how to read. He found a book called The Columbian Orator. It told stories of liberty and tyranny, starting in the ancient world and coming up to a debate between a master and a slave. And Douglas was tutored in reading by the wife of one of his slave owners. And he heard a conversation between the person who, quote unquote, owned him and that man's wife, forbidding her to do any of that tutoring. He said if she continued in that vein, it would make him unfit for slavery. Douglas was smart. He heard that and said, that's exactly what I'm going to continue to do. I'm going to continue to enrich my soul with words and with ideas. And what he realized as he read on is that he was a person full of dignity, endowed with rights. And he came to a sense of confidence in that was unmistakable. The way he relates it, he said that he really freed himself in mind before he was freed in reality. So that by the time it came for him to choose the moment in which he would start to resist those who enslaved him, he was ready. That itself is another part of his saga, which is gut-wrenching, because there was one night in which, having endured daily beatings from a man who was hired to, quote unquote, really subdue him, right, to break him was the language of the day, Douglas resisted with physical violence. He could have killed that man, Edward Covey, but decided not to. After he did that, that man did not touch him again. It took a little bit longer for him to devise his escape plan. Escape he did. He went up north, Massachusetts, New York, and he became that orator that we started with, the best known of all who had been enslaved. So eloquent that people would say to him, "You were not a slave." And he would say, "I was, and would you like to see my diploma? It's written on my back." This is a remarkable person. But you know, what I want to relate about abolition here, and then we'll talk very briefly about suffrage and then close out with John Lewis. Douglas had to go through his own kind of struggle because he fell in with a bunch of abolitionists that said, while the Declaration had lofty sentiments, the Constitution was bunk. It was a blood-soaked covenant. It was a bargain with the devil. It was bad. In its compromises, it compromised away the whole ballgame. And so the Garrisonian camp, William Lloyd Garrison, had a hold on Douglas. You know what he did, though? He kept reading. And he went back to some of the documents that we've looked at. He went back to the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention. He anchored himself in that ringbolt, the Declaration, but he read and he read, and he came to the conclusion that what the founders did in the Constitution was kind of put up a kind of awning. It was a kind of attachment to the building, but what they were trying to do is really let the whole of the institution of slavery be undermined with their arguments. Now, you may or may not agree with Douglas's position, but as he started to read more, he came around to that position. And I think what was fascinating about this is he had to break with all of the people that had made him so famous. He did so in his own newspaper. he announced that he had come to a change of opinion. And what his opinion change meant is that he was bringing the Constitution and the Declaration together as twins, as saying that the one flows from the other, and that we had to be political. The abolitionists had to be political. They had to muck about in the grime and dirt of politics and recognize that compromise was not the enemy, slavery was. Douglass was a man of remarkable principle because he fought not only for people like him that had been enslaved, he also was the only black man to attend and speak at Seneca Falls. You've read the sentiments. Lots of controversy there, right? That movement was not a monolith. It was divided from the get-go. Douglass, in fact, had to break after the Seneca Falls Declaration of 1848 with his dear friends and collaborators, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton. One of the things that we were struck by as the Bill of Rights Institute marked the centenary of women gaining the right to vote is that that movement for suffrage was a model for how to do social change with a constitutional underpinning. Think of these steps: define the problem, set a goal, pursue education, work with others. This is how we kind of made it relevant to students. Build on prior knowledge, seek allies and public support, constructive challenge, right? Learn that you're not going to agree with everybody in your movement or coalition, but you can still work with them to get something done. Reevaluate and correct course, and think outside the box. If we had time to break down the abolitionists, all three of these struggles, what you would see that they have in common is to go back to that ring bolt. They anchored to that, the Declaration. And they said, we can be better than we are right now. We don't have to invent a new human being, a new model of citizenship. We don't have to invent the whole regime. We do have to rededicate ourselves to that proposition. And we got to work tirelessly. From Seneca Falls to the 19th Amendment was 70 years. Let's fast forward as we close to the March on Washington. You know, we've had a chance to reflect on Letter from Birmingham Jail, truly remarkable document that distills the essence of the Declaration of Independence, I think, brilliantly. The natural law, the natural rights foundation. Wait. Can't you wait a little longer? Does the Declaration counsel waiting? King's answer is, no way. The Declaration counsels prudence, but that's not weakness. It's not timidity. It's knowing how to get to a just end. And he's saying, we have justice on our side. We all know his lines from the most famous speech of August 28th, 1963, right? So Birmingham Jail happens in April. He's sprung with $160,000 of bail, and they're planning for this huge march. How many of you have read or seen all the speeches there? So you got a really young, 23-year-old John Lewis, and he writes an absolute barn burner of a speech. I mean, you got to see this thing. It is something else. And he is saying, just like Douglass did on July 5th, why are we still in this place? Why have we not acted on these principles? We know the principles. Why has it taken us so long? And Lewis puts his speech in front of the people who were running the thing. And they said to him, you can't give this speech. It'll turn everybody away. And he changed some things. He moderated his tone. And one of the things that he changed, I think, is really interesting, and I'll close with this. He talked about a revolution that was needed. And he didn't talk about any other date. And the suggestion that came to him is, why don't you talk about the revolution of 1776? And Lewis took that and said, okay, today what we're going to do at this March on Washington is repair back to this idea. Could we complete the revolution of 1776? That's the words he used. Those are the words he used. What do you think of that? Is that the arc that we're on? It's not an inevitable arc. I think sometimes, textbooks are terrible for so many reasons. We could spend the rest of our afternoon detailing them, right? Nobody has ever curled up with a great textbook in front of the fire, right? But they kind of present this thing like there's an arc of inevitability. That King standing there was just sort of the natural culmination. And what I think we need to index on is just how hard it was to get even to that point. And what I'll leave you with in this Lewis kind of provocative or kind of provocation is that how we understand the inheritance today? That as we go forward in our next 250 years, what we're seeking to do is not to change the nature of human beings, or even to fundamentally change the nature of our regime. It's not to upend a regime oriented to natural rights, but it is to say, how can we put those principles into practice? Douglas called them final. King called them final. Lewis saw them as final. What do those final, definitive principles counsel us to do to preserve the next 250 years? Let me stop there. I'll thank you all for your time today.
Well, David, I think I speak for everybody when I say we're grateful for that tour of our inheritance, our constitutional inheritance. We're going to take a few questions from the audience, so if you want to think about what you'd like to ask, be cogitating on that, and we'll have some folks go around with microphones, but I'm going to selfishly ask a couple of questions first and drill down on some of this. First, I'd like to ask, we think about, and you've helped us to think about how people have used the principles of the Declaration as agents of change. And Douglas's language of a ring bolt, an anchor, suggests something conservative, small c, conservative, you're right, a preservation of something, being anchored to something. I wonder if you can think of instances where clinging to, and he uses this language too, clinging to the principles of the Declaration has been a preservative force. That is, what mistakes have we held ourselves back from as a people as a result of clinging to that? Because I don't know if we spend as much time thinking about those things. They're not as evident to us because they're there. So where does the Declaration function as this anchoring force?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and thank you for the easy question, Matthew. I think the American Revolution is not the French Revolution, right? We didn't try to start the calendar anew. We didn't try to remake humanity. And that was intentional. That was not accidental. So I think that kind of clinging sense, which for Douglass had this sort of admiration and celebration, right? I think he was torn. His private writings, his public speeches, his autobiographies make this relentlessly clear, that he felt like so often completely alienated. And I think there are many people and movements over the course of our history that have felt exactly that. They're kind of July 5th Americans, right? Which is not to say that they're necessarily bad Americans. It's that they're on the outside looking in and saying, where's the extension of these principles, however enduring they might be, to me? They don't seem to apply. And yet, because of the tethering nature of and their finality, the project is not to remake citizenship, nor is it to do what the French sought to do or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does, which is to say we are going to confer a bunch of material rights to you to try to make up for things that have been for which you have been deprived. Right? Your natural rights is the inheritance. That has prevented, I think, a lot of the sort of totalizing revolutions, while at the same time it's stoked the right kind of urgency. I think anybody would be hard-pressed to read John Lewis's first draft or a second draft and not say, you're spot on to feel this way. And so that's at least my first thought.
Oh, that's great. That's good to think about. We usually think of it as a revolutionary document, but I remember the phrase that Martin Diamond famously attached to it was that a revolution of sober expectations that was seeking to preserve as much about self-government as it was discarding. And it's a useful exercise to think about what we cling to. You've talked a little bit about the exemplary character of suffragists, of abolitionists, of King and his compatriots in their efforts and how that was informed by these virtues. What do you think? I mean, we're approaching America 250. We're urging people to read the Declaration. I don't know how many towns are left in America where it's read aloud every 4th of July, and I'm almost certain I've never met a person, I think, who can recite the entire document like Laura Ingalls Wilder's hometown. Must have been an interesting place. But as we're reading it now, what do you think accrues to Americans if you're sitting down with students saying, read this afresh in 2025 and 2026? What is it that the Declaration is reminding us of that we're not getting otherwise? That is what lacuna, what gap is it filling in either that's our national discourse, our system of education, our political culture?
Well, when you ask Americans, not even describing that you're citing the Declaration of Independence, what do you think of this? You see broad agreement to about 80% of the populace. So the reason that I'm certainly concerned about the state of the country, but I have confidence that there is a kind of exhausted majority. That though they're not getting up in the morning and circling, Constitution Day like we in this room might, or, pulling out a reading packet or, a pocket copy of the Constitution or Declaration, right? We don't need that. What we need is it in the hearts. And I think the answer is when you look at private opinion polling, people still believe in these core principles. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens when they talk to pollsters. Todd Rose at Populous has done some really great work here. Also, the More in Common group, which did a study on the history wars. We have come to believe so much that we're in this pitched battle that we want to tell other people that we're in a pitched battle that will have no end. And so we're kind of conforming to the conventional wisdom rather than repairing to what actually we are holding. And so the job of civics today, the job I take it of the Bill of Rights Institute, is to help young people tap into that. The reason that I'm at the Bill of Rights Institute right now goes back to the first day I had teaching on my own at Boston College. And I quoted from the Declaration of Independence. You know, you're really eager. You remember your first day teaching, right? You're coming in, it's gonna be amazing. And I quoted from the Declaration, and not one set of eyes in the class registered that they recognized what I was saying. You know, that's not such a big shock to any of us now, but to me at the time, it kind of took me by surprise. And I thought, wow, we really are not like teaching this stuff. And it's not like there's an era we go back in history and say, well, we really had it all solved, right? And they were internalizing these things, and that's why I think that we kind of, you know, being so negative on young people, blaming them, is not the route at all. It's on us. We got to let them read it with fresh eyes. But I think there's, just to read it is to say, yeah, you know, most people say, yep, check, that seems about right. Not too radical, but still revolutionary, right? That's the kind of thing that we can still agree on and say, we have that as our goal as a people.
That's a wonderful thing to think on. Do we have any questions from you all? I'd love to turn and take some questions from the audience. I think we have some microphones. There we go. We've got a microphone coming your way. Sage can fight her way to the...
Just wondering, we talked about factionalism in the early session. So, you know, I don't think we can answer that. But other than that, what do you think in 2025 would be something that's threatening our Constitution, other than factionalism or bipartisanship?
Well, Matthew, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. I'll say I think you have to remember what the definition of faction is, right? So it's not just an interest group. I live in Washington, the Washington, D.C. area. My first office in the nation's capital, we shared a space with the lobbyists for people who make rubber-soled shoes, right? So there's every kind of interest group afoot. But that's not the problem. The question is, are they acting inimical to the common good? And so that's a hard one to figure out, which faction is actually doing that. But you got to multiply them so that none can overrule. I guess, you know, Jill Lepore has just come out with a book suggesting that we need to make the amendment process a lot easier. I don't see it that way. I think there was wisdom in making it really difficult to amend the Constitution. And as I said in my remarks, I don't think that it or our practice of it has been perfect. But it seems to me that the answers are, rather than kind of tinkering with the mechanisms right now, campaign finance reform, you know, we could put a list of 10 things out there. The main thing is to look at ourselves in the mirror and to kind of cut through this collective action problem, right? Where we're saying if the exhausted majority thing is really true, then let's act that way. Let's work with people. Douglas said he'll work with anybody as long as they're doing right. That's an interesting model right there. What kind of solutions can we come up with on a particular issue that might not hold for every issue? That's my initial thought.
Well, it is the case that we're somewhat mistaken about the degree of our division, which I think David's pointed this out certainly with respect to the exhausted majority and with respect to perceptions of Americans when you ask them about what their children ought to learn in school, for example. Parents aren't that actually all that divided on the essential things that they think students ought to learn, including things they ought to learn about our history and about the country. And you could extend that further. I know Verlin Lewis, the Sterling Chair in our center, has got this great book with his brother Hiram, Myth of Left and Right. And you know, it points out that our polarization is in some sense perceived. We've imposed it on ourselves. We don't actually disagree with our fellow Americans about everything all at the same time. There are, in fact, groups of Americans who are deeply opposed on the question of abortion and deeply opposed on the question of, name your topic. What is not the case is that there are these massive factions of Americans, 40% on one side and 40% on the other side, who all agree with each other and disagree with the other team. That is a misperception of the way that our civil society works. And it's a misperception that's, I would actually defend the two-party system. I don't think there's anything wrong with having political parties. They're pretty essential. I can name some countries that don't have political parties. They're all totalitarian regimes. But I do think the solution to it is to move away from the political to some extent. I'm not suggesting people be disengaged, but the degree to which you interact with other human beings in your community on a basis that has nothing to do with your political party, our situation will get better. The more places you find yourself in face to face with other human beings, and the question of your political party is not relevant to that relationship, the better off we will be. It's a better reflection of reality, because actually none of us are just simply Republicans or simply, actually a few of you are actually simply, like you are totally signed on in this room, but most of us are not actually that simple. And so encountering other human beings in these spaces. So our politics desperately needs non-political engagement, I think. The biggest thing our politics need is not structural reform. It is not political engagement. I don't think it's more people voting. I think it's more people interacting with other human beings in places where politics is not relevant. And that would, that sounds like a really, kumbaya sort of solution, but I think that rests on institutions that aren't political. How many institutions are left in our society where we do that?
Actually, I don't think it's that unrealistic. If you look at the roots of suffragism, for example, it came from the art of association. So that civil society groups, having been the outlet for mainly women to be involved, but men also, including the predecessor of what is now the League of Women Voters, right? Lots of permutations of these came together to say we need to engender a movement. And before it became political, it was rooted in civil society. That's how we've made change in America. And I think what we see with young people is, the research around clinical depression. You might think that what a person who is clinically depressed might need is more time to reflect on their own position and their own person. What they're finding is that if they can do something for somebody else in their immediate orbit, it helps them immeasurably. I think something of the same sort works for teenagers, not because of the mental health crisis that we see with teens, but maybe even taking that into account. It's not just the phones, but in real life, locally. What happens when you ask a young person to boil the ocean and to solve a universal problem? It doesn't work, and then they become despondent about the democratic project. That's, I think, the cycle that we're setting up a lot of kids for. And that's why civics shouldn't be about activism. But it should be active. It should be about building skills. And when those skills can be built around problem solving in your local community, for example, even when there's failure, I think we can start to see that cycle of resiliency. Try it again, right? The lesson of the suffragists is don't give up, because it took them a long time. Same thing for abolitionism, of course, the same thing for the civil rights movement.
Do we have other questions? I am sure in this room, there's a hand in the back.
How did we come to the myth of polarization? Where that media framing, or?
So the question is, how did we come to the myth of polarization? Is that just media framing? Well, it's not a myth. It depends on how we define polarization. Americans think they hate each other. That is a truth. When they meet each other face to face, they don't. So what we hate, what we think we hate, is an abstract team B. right? The truth is, Team B also thinks that you hate them. And we deeply overestimate, not only empirically, like the degree of our disagreement. We have more in common than we think. But we also overestimate how much the other side dislikes us. So Republicans grossly overestimate how much antipathy Democrats feel toward Republicans. And Democrats grossly overestimate how much antipathy. So if you ask Republicans, like, what's your view of Democrats? You know, are they horrible people or are they okay? You know, there's a spectrum. I don't know all the options. They say, well, you know, it's somewhere on the spectrum. If you ask them, though, how much does the other side dislike you? How do they see you? They estimate the other side's views about them in a really erroneous way. So I do think a lot of it's self-perceived. We do have meaningful political divisions. We have two political parties that do have meaningfully different policy platforms. Most of the people in those political parties, though, are not unreservedly attached to all the positions of the party. You know, we're all sort of weak-kneed Republicans or weak-kneed Democrats, right? We're not really willing to go to the mat on everything. So the perception has a lot to do with our degree of affective partisanship, the way we feel about the other side. Certainly polarization there in the way we think they feel about us. There's much less polarization in terms of being able to construct a Team A and a Team B that agree internally. So it exists very well. Lots and lots of Democrats think we should close our borders. And lots of Republicans think there should be access to abortion. It's just, you know, those are the facts. But they don't feel that way. And that's partly because our political elites are polarized. So the people we put on television, they're polarized, but they're not ordinary Americans.
Yeah, it's a great question about origin. I'll just say a couple things since we're all working with young people. How does negative affective polarization impact teenagers and even those who are preteens? You know, a simple kind of working definition of negative affective polarization is that you learn to hate the right people. And you can immediately define yourself not according to even what you're in favor of. Well, at least I'm not Team B. And we can hate those people. And when you have that kind of in the cultural milieu like we do, a couple of Stanford political scientists looked at this and said, when are we starting to see the first signs of this kind of negative affective polarization? And it's actually as young as 11. And what we see, I don't know what you all see in your classrooms, but what we see at the Bill of Rights Institute is that it changes the way that kids are approaching friendship and their ability to talk about tough issues. If you see your parents and adults in your world forsaking friendships in favor of a political position or a partisan position, you might not be as eager to kind of go there and touch third rails. So the Knight Foundation in 2022 did a poll and said that 56% of high school students feel comfortable disagreeing with their peers in class. We hear that from teachers around the country, that the hardest thing, and I think Sean asked a good question. Sean, are you here? Sean Fessler? Great question today about how do we take this stuff back, right? I mean, how would you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates in class without hearing it maybe from a parent, a principal, a superintendent, or a legal counsel, right? That's what it's come to a lot of times. And it's that one voice that can shut down the deliberation. But I think what we have to do is push back in a concerted way, model for young people that, no, we can actually have these conversations. And we can have them robustly. They need to be upheld. Because I think that kind of defining polarization or showing it kind of all the way down is having a profound impact on the way that young people are processing information and disagreeing with one another. And that's a worrying trend.
There's a hand here. Let's get the microphone. That way our friends online will be able to hear you.
I teach 5th grade, and I was just talking to our table about how you were talking about these fundamental skills of civics, and that's what we should be focusing on. And it's kind of advantage for younger grades, like 5th grade, where we are in the same classroom the full day, where we can focus on those skills. But what would you say those skills and those like concrete like things that would set them up for later success in talking about civics and things like that, that we could do in like a 5th grade setting where we do have the same community every single day for every single subject?
Great question. Every teacher is a civics teacher. The question is whether they're intentional about it or not, right? You all have that as your professional charge, but every teacher in your building is modeling what it is to be a citizen one way or another. So the most important thing, I think, is that you are conferring to them some level of decision-making and problem-solving in a really tangible way. And sometimes a hypothetical or a kind of imagined world, like, let's create our own constitution, and then let's live by the rules. 5th graders can do that. Then they start to understand what a regime is, and that's really interesting. My son is running for student council, and I asked him, what's your platform? And he said, I don't know, we can't do anything. So think of it, right? We have service learning in this country, and what service learning is mandatory voluntarism. You know what kids learn from service learning? They learn about that we are teaching them authoritarianism. I hate to say it. The studies reveal that, and our experience. What do we do about self-governance? We say, you gotta be self-governing. And the schools don't give them anything to do except choose the day on which pizza will be served. Now, I'm not suggesting that you turn your class over to the kids. That would be, ill-advised, especially with 5th graders, right? But you see kind of the point. Are there things are there exercises that you can do, like teach them how to run a meeting and teach them Robert's Rules of Order. That's a really interesting thing, and then make them abide by that during a bunch of the year. Critical thinking, of course, is the key thing. We have a project called My Impact Challenge at the Bill of Rights Institute, where you pick a problem in your local community and you try to solve it. As it turns out, it's really hard for kids to start a farmer's market. But that's a great exercise, because even in failure, we rewarded one team that failed. And then they came back the next year, had applied the prize money, and succeeded. So think of exercises that can build that sense of resiliency. Because too often what we're saying is you gotta succeed the first time, all the time, and then when kids realize that democracy requires all those virtues that we shouted out, and that it's really hard, if they fail, they say, well, the problem's in the democracy, the problem's in the principles of the Declaration, the problem's in the principles of the Constitution. So there's a really great paper that I'd recommend to you all, and the last thing I'll say is, look at Educating for American Democracy, EAD for short. It's a cross-ideological project, and there was a white paper done about experiential learning. Rachel Davison Humphreys is a co-author. She wrote with about 10 others, including Danielle Allen, who's a very interesting scholar of the Declaration, among many other things. There's a chart in that paper on experiential learning that breaks it down to answer your question about 10 different practical things that you can do in the 5th grade classroom.
Oh, that is great and wonderful practical advice. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us for lunch. That's going to conclude our Q&A. I think, Robert, we have some additional information to convey, so in just a moment we're going to get out of the way, and then the CTLI team is going to come let you know where we're headed next and give us all marching orders. I want to say thank you, David, for joining us for this. This has been a tremendous learning opportunity, and thank you for sharing the day with us and sharing your tremendous insight, which is born not just of academic exercise, but of the kind of statesmanship you've undertaken in the leadership of the Bill of Rights Institute. And I think that's emblematic, by the way, of the fact that breaking out of some of these misperceptions we have, Americans don't know enough about their own constitutional inheritance. They don't know enough about it to preserve it or to improve it. And some of that's the fault of the folks who have had a captive audience for decades in our classrooms. Us professors have a lot to answer for. And And this is true. The more education you have, the more polarized you are. Our college classrooms are not turning out broad-minded people who are capable of dealing with difference and who understand these things, but we are fixing that. David is emblematic of the kind of scholar that stepped out of the classroom and into public service to do this kind of work, and centers like ours and a lot of colleagues elsewhere are emblematic of an effort to be more responsible in the way we educate our population, the way that we undertake our responsibility to convey our civic tradition and our constitutional inheritance to the next generation. So we're glad that you're joining us in that work, and thank you for joining us today.